Hello everyone. So now we'll discuss about the file transfer protocol, that is FTP. Right, what is FTP? As the name itself is indicating, it is a file transfer protocol. It is used to transfer the files from one directory to the other directory, or from one local system to the other remote system, or from remote system to a local system. So there is a file transfer between a local system and a remote system. That is what we call it as FTP, file transfer protocol. Again, this file transfer protocol is this is one of the protocol of an application layer itself. Okay. So now normally in this case of FTP, what exactly it will happen is that there will be one user. Okay. There will be one user. So this user interacts or wants to transfer a file to one of the remote directory which is present here. Okay. So now since this user wants to have the access to this remote account, so now this user must provide its username and the password. The user must provide the user identification and the password. Now, after providing this authorization or after providing this information, this server will verify whether this user is an authorized person or not. Is this authorized information or not? If it thinks that this is an authorized information, then this server or this user can transfer the files from this local system to this remote host, right? So and also if it authorization, if it gets for this user, then it can copy the file which is present in this remote system to its local directory or the local system, right? So this is what actually the FTP is going to do. Okay. So now first thing what happens, this user will interact with FTP through a FTP user agent. So this is what the FTP user agent, right? FTP user interface is there, no? This is what FTP user agent. This user provides the host name of the remote host. So for where I should communicate, for which remote host I should communicate, that will be provided by this agent. Now this makes this client to connect or establish a connection to this FTP server. Now this client will connect or establish a connection to this FTP server via a TCP connection. It will establish a TCP connection between a FTP client and a FTP server. So once this TCP connection is done, now this user will send its user identification and the password. So now once the server receives its username and the password, now it will verify, and if it is an authorized person, then this server, what it will do, it allows the user to copy one or more files from this remote system to this local system, or this user can also transfer the files from one or more files from this local system to remote system. Now this is the actual way or the procedure how actually the FTP will establish a connection. Right. So now regarding this establishing of connection, we will speak some few more things, right? Now what exactly it is? See, now we have spoke about HTTP still now. So if HTTP and FTP are both file transfer protocols. Okay, both are file transfer protocols. HTTP it will give an URL, it will fetch the web page, or it will fetch the image, it will download the image, or it will download the file. But FTP, it is purely related for file purpose only. Okay, either you can transfer the files or you can get the files from the remote host, right? So even though HTTP and FTP both are looks like same, but there is some few differences are there. Okay. Now the very important thing is that the FTP actually uses two different parallel TCP connection to transfer a file. Okay, so as like in this diagram you can see, this is a FTP client and this is the FTP server. It is using two separate TCP connections between a client and a server. Now what is these two connections? The first one is the TCP control connection. The other one is the TCP data connection. There are two connections are there. One is control connection, the other one is data connection. Now what you mean by this is, see now first of all, what you mean by a control connection is that this control connection is actually used for sending some control informations between the client and the server. Now what you mean by control information? Control information can be something like my user identification, it can be a password, it can be something like a commands I'm sending from client to server or from server to client, whatever it is. Okay, or I can tell I want to change the remote directory itself. Okay, some commands like put or get, that means get means I am getting the files from the remote host, put means I am putting some files which is there in local host to the remote host. So these kind of commands, so these type of commands should only be sent in the control connection only. And as we all know that HTTP is having some port number, it was having a port number 80. So similarly in this FTP, for a TCP control connection, it will use a port number 21. It will be using the port number 21, right? So along with this, as I told, there are one more TCP connection. So that TCP connection we call it a TCP data connection, and this data connection uses the port number 20. Now what purpose the data connection is used now? The data connection is used for transferring of data, or in this case transferring of files only, right? So purely this TCP data connection is used to transfer the files, that's all. So now since now this FTP uses a separate control connection and a data connection, because control information are sent in separate line, data are sent in separate line, we call this as out of band. So we call this as out of band. But when I come to HTTP, in HTTP I will be sending the request in the same line, I will be getting the web page or getting the file or getting the image in the same line itself. So since both command lines and the data are coming on the same line, HTTP we call it as in band. Why? Because all the control informations will be sent on the same data line, that is why we call it as in band. So right, so this is all about the differences what we can see between an HTTP and an FTP. The very important thing you should remember is that in case of FTP we uses two separate parallel TCP connection. One is for TCP control connection, that is used to send the controls, send the commands or user identification, password, some commands like put and get and so on, and this control connection uses a port number 21. Similarly, the one more connection is the TCP data connection, which is purely used to transfer the files in this line, and this uses the port number 20. Right. So now normally what exactly happens during this communication during the FTP process is that now when user starts an FTP session with a remote host, now what happens is that the client side of the FTP, that is the user, first initiates the control TCP connection first with the server side. Correct? No? The client should initiate the TCP control connection with the server first. Okay? At which port number? At port number 21. Right. Now after this, the client side of the FTP should send the user identification and the password over this control connection. Okay. Next, the client side of the FTP also sends over the control connection some commands to change the remote directory and so on. These things will be sent. But before that, now when the server side receives a command for a file transfer over the control connection, okay, the server side, after verifying the username and password, once it thinks that it's an authorized user. Once it get the information that what file it should transfer, then only it will start initiating to establish a new TCP data connection to the client side. So once everything is fine and good with its authentication, with its authorization, and when it knows about the file name and all, then only the server will establish a TCP data connection to the client side. So once this client side establish a FTP data connection, then only this server side will start sending the files. Either it can be one file or more number of files. If I have given a list, then it will start sending one by one files. But normally what happens, once the FTP sends one file over the data connection, then immediately the FTP server will closes that data connection. Okay, are you getting this point? So very important thing is, once the FTP server transfers the file to the client, at the FTP server it will close the TCP data connection. If suppose, if in the during the same session, if user wants to transfer another file, then FTP opens another data connection, right? So that is why, but one thing you should be you should understand that this TCP control connection will still be existing. It will still be existing even though I can have 100 number of files to be transferred, the TCP control connection will be the same. But only the TCP data connection, after transferring every file, it will closes the connection and again it will re-establish the connection in order to transfer the new files. Right? So now since this data connection is again and again it closing and opening for transferring a new file, this TCP data connection we call it as non-persistent connection. As you all know what you mean by non-persistent now. So TCP data connection is a non-persistent connection and TCP control connection is a persistent connection. Okay, right. Okay, so now as we all studied that, now FTP will be sending some commands, okay, from client to server, and also it will get a reply from server to client. Okay, so now in this case, now what are the commands the client will send? Let me see some few examples over here. See, one example is username colon, I'll type the username there. So what is this indicating? It is indicating this command I am used to send the user identification to the server. Similarly, I have the next command password colon, I'll type the password here. So what it is indicating? It is used to send the user password to the server. Now I have the one more command called as list. Now what is this list? This list is something like a list of files which should be sent from the server, that means from the remote directory to the local directory. Right? Next is RETR. RETR stands for retrieve the file name. So I am retrieving the files from the remote directory to the local directory. Similarly, STOR stands for store file name followed with all the file names. So this tells that I am going to store the files from my local directory to the remote directory. So these are all the some few examples of the FTP commands which we can see frequently. And now we'll see some of the replies what we'll get from the server side. See, every time when I send a command, when I send a username or when I send a password, it should reply to that telling that your username is okay, your password is required. That kind of messages should be sent by the server. Now, how the server will reply, in what format? See, it will reply with code, something like 331. It is a three digits code, 331. Now what is this 331 is telling? 331 is telling that username is okay now, password is required. Okay. Next number is 125. What is this 125 tells? It tells the data connection already open, transfer starting. So it will always tells what is the status of the transferring of files. Now 425, it will tell cannot open data connection. 452, error in writing a file. Right. So this is all about the FTP commands and the replies. Fine. Okay. So this is all about FTP. Thank you.